Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Doing Well. And on this week's episode, we're going to talk about the importance of sexual pleasure. Now, I personally know that this is a topic that's hard to talk about for a lot of people. So I'm interested in exploring this even for myself, not just for the conversation's sake. I'm just really keen to do this and talk to Dr. Simone Buzwell today about it because she's been experienced in this area for, a number of years. And I think it's going to be fun because she has a wide areas of expertise. She has lots of different things that she's been doing in her career so far, and we'll get to hear from her soon. And by way of introduction, she is an academic psychologist who has worked in the areas of health and developmental psychology for almost 30 years. Her specialties include sexuality and sexual behavior, as well as body dysmorphic disorder and cosmetic procedures. Dr. Buzwell also spent a number of years as an associate dean, during which she engaged in research into higher education, including being the project leader of an OLT grant named Valuing Student Voices when exploring, creating, and planning for the future of Australian higher education. Her current projects include a funded project developing, validating, and implementing an ethical cosmetic procedure screening tool for minor and a suite of projects examining factors that enhance sexual pleasure. It's a mouthful of a bio, so apologies, I tripped a little bit there, but I had to read it all out because it's so interesting to me, Simone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Lou.
Yeah, well, as I was talking to you earlier, these areas are sort of varying and, especially the piece about higher education is kind of different from the rest. I know today's topic is about sexual pleasure, and that's the areas that you said yourself that you've been experienced in for the longest, and in your career. And given the fact that your career has been so fascinating, going through lots of different areas, I would love to get you to share a bit more about your professional journey with our audience. How did you get here? How did you get to do so many different things? And, most importantly, why did you choose to major in and, really specialize in the areas of sexuality and sexual behavior?
That's one of the things about having such a long academic career. You get to dabble in all sorts of different interesting areas. And that's the special thing also about being in psychology, because psychology being about human behavior, there's so many different interesting human behaviors to explore. Now, I started off looking at sexuality very on in my career when I did a PhD looking at how adolescents construct their views of their sexual selves in the 1990s. So that's how I started off, looking at sexuality, and I've continued on from there, exploring different domains of sexuality.
That is so interesting. And why did you choose this area particularly for yourself, especially for your PhD? That's a long body of work. So I'm guessing there's got to be a story there.
My PhD happened I did it in the late 1990s when there was lots of talks about HIV and AIDS, and that's where quite a bit of funding was, and I had a scholarship to explore how to prevent HIV and different STIs at that stage. So that's how it happened, and I started doing explorations about how people then develop their feelings of themselves as a sexual being. And that acts on their behaviour.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what we're going to talk about today, right? Because sexual pleasure is a topic that I think we all know. People probably don't talk about this very often, especially even in friends groups. It's kind of like a topic that gets avoided the most, I guess. So I think today's conversation will be enlightening for our audience and for myself, especially. I don't talk to my friends about this very often. So this will be fun.
Well, that's really interesting. And my friends, as I used to talking about it, because I've been working in this area for so long, and so
Yeah.
I'm quizzing them, getting their opinions about different things. Because you're right, so many people don't discuss it enough, and we don't know what's normal in this domain. So we sort of listen to things that might not be true, and there's so many myths that people believe, and it impacts their sexual pleasure and their sexual abilities.
Yeah, definitely. Well, again, I'm excited to talk about it. But before we get into that part of the conversation, let's talk a bit more about you. We have this part where we called Have You Met Simone? And we'll get some of your recommendations and favorite things, as I mentioned to you earlier. So, first thing first, what is a book you would recommend?
I'm currently reading this book called To Paradise by Hanya Girahara. Sorry. Um, it's one of those things it's a long book. It's about 800 pages, and I've read
Wow.
most of it, and I've been a bit delayed finishing it off. So I'm feeling a bit guilty at the moment, 'cause I keep wanting to finish it and things are getting in the way. But it's a very interesting, long, but very interesting book.
Yeah, that is a long book. I don't think I've read a book that long before.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, they're a fantastic author, and they first wrote another one called A Little Life, which is amazing. So that's probably my favorite. So I thought I'd try their sequel.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to have to look into it because it sounds fascinating. Now, what is a movie you would recommend?
A movie that I saw, it was probably a couple of years ago, but it just really struck me, was called Prima Facie. It has Jodie Comer in it, so I don't know if you know that actress. She was in Killing Eve and a few other things. And it's such a powerful movie, Prima Facie. It's a one-woman show all the way through. It's a film based on a theatre production.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about a situation where a lawyer is prosecuting a rape case, and then goes through the same experience herself, is a survivor of rape herself.
Okay, that must have been both tough and touching to watch. So yeah, really good recommendation. Thank you. Now, I know you are our guest of the day, and this might be tough because some guests say that they don't listen to podcasts. I wonder if you do, and if you do, which one would you recommend?
I'm so sorry I can't recommend any. So this is my first time doing a podcast, so it's a whole new experience. So
Yeah.
there's been such a generational thing. I keep wanting to get into podcasts, so this has now inspired me to go and explore more after.
Yeah, cool. Well, definitely. I think you'll find a whole new world out there with podcast to explore. So that'll be fun. Okay, who's your role model?
My role model has been my PhD supervisor. I mean, it's a long time ago, but she's so bright and intelligent, and it was always perfectly dressed and extremely stylish as well. So having all those and very into art too. So she had lots of different domains to her life. So she's always been a role model to me.
Amazing. Yeah. I love when people talk about people in their lives that are so inspiring. And yeah, I think we should all find people like that in our lives to kind of, keep the sparks alive and you just feel really engaged in life because there's so much to explore. And yeah, I'm glad you have that person. Now, final question in this part.
So I should say her name too. It's Professor Doreen Rosenthal.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you for sharing the name. Some people just don't like to share names sometimes. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. Final question in this part. I know that you've probably taught a lot of people, but in terms of learning, I wonder which course you've learned that left a really strong impact on you.
The courses that I've done, so the formal academic courses, I did an honours degree in psychology and then a PhD majoring in psychology. So they both left major impacts on me, of course, especially the PhD, where you get to really immerse yourself in a topic and become the expert in that domain.
Yeah.
Other topics that I've done some different sexual therapy courses to help train people in that area. And that's really good for just sort of getting outside your comfort zone and becoming comfortable with these topics.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing. And now let's talk about today's topic. We are here to talk about well-being and sexual pleasure. So I think this is the perfect time for us to start by probably setting the scene for the conversation. Let's start with well-being. Obviously we know that it's a very big topic and it means different things to different people. So I mean, I think I've heard about 50 different, 50 different definitions or, points of views from our guests so far. And so today I wonder what you think about well-being personally.
For me personally, well-being's when all domains in my life are traveling along and they're all functional. So when my relationship's going well, my family, work, social life, when everything's all just working and functional, that's when I'm happy and feeling well-being.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very holistic approach. It's not just about us, right? It's about all the different facets of our lives, and especially relationships play such an important part. So now we've also heard quite a few misconceptions on this show so far. And I know that you work with a lot of different people, especially in the domain of sexuality and sexual behavior. I wonder if that impacts your opinions at all, but it doesn't have to be about that particular area. It's just a thought that I have. I wonder what you think to be some of the biggest misconceptions that people have when it comes to well-being.
I find the biggest misconceptions people have is that they have no control over their well-being and they can't do something about it. So it's an area that you can be very, very proactive in and make changes. But sometimes you need help to do that. And so being a psychologist, I always suggest that you do go and seek people to help you if you can't do it yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's such an important point because sometimes I do think that people have this sense of, oh, I'm in the backseat of my own well-being. I cannot really take control. And maybe there are days when you feel like that, but I think it's important to get back into the driver's seat when you realize that, oh, something is off or, like I'm not really in control. And taking back the control and, know that you can actually work on your well-being is such an important thing. I know that for myself, recently, sometimes some days I'm kind of like, oh, I just don't know what's happening. Like I'm just going with the flow and just following my routine and whatnot. And I don't really feel a sense of well-being. But then when I realized that, and this is actually very important because you mentioned the point about, the different facets of your life and people in your life. And I think talking to friends for me really helps to put things into perspective because they would give me ideas. Oh, what would make you feel better? What would nourish your well-being generally? Or sometimes they ask me questions like, what did you enjoy doing as a kid to bring you that sense of engagement? And when I heard those questions, I'm just so touched. My best friend asked me that the other day and I was like, oh, wow, it's such a good question. I don't know. I need to think. And then when I found the answer, I was like, okay, now I'm going to go do that. And, it actually helped to take back that control and really work on my well-being because sometimes we feel like we're doing the work, but it's not really leading us anywhere. So I think knowing how to do the work is important too.
I think that's an excellent point. So just thinking through those different aspects. And that sort of relates to something else I was just thinking is about resilience, about our well-being, that we'll all have ups and downs as we go along, but it's how you bounce back from when something negative happens and just remembering that you can bounce back and how you've done it in the past can be really useful.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Speaking of which, we actually have a show about personal resilience at LMSL, and it's called Bouncing Back. The Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast. So if our audience is interested in that show, and if you're interested in that show because you just got into podcasting, you can explore that as well. That'll be fun. Now, we're here today to talk about the importance of sexual pleasure. And as we briefly mentioned before, this is not talked about very often. And because we have such a wide range of audience for this show, a lot of people that listen to this podcast come from countries, for example, in Southeast Asia that don't talk about this topic very often or at all. So for those people in our audience, how would you define sexual pleasure?
Well, I think this is a really important question. When I started working in this area more recently, because the previous work was more based on prevention, people think, oh, everyone understands what sexual pleasure is, but they don't. It's actually much more complex than people really perceive. And that sexual pleasure has, when we think about it, it's more about a holistic sense of, sometimes people call it of energy and feelings of desire, but it does come in two broad forms. I mean, there's desire for another, for your partner or sexual other, or also desire for yourself. So solo and dyadic desire, it's in those two components.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very interesting because sometimes we hear the word and we're just like, oh, yeah, I kind of know what that's about. But I think it's much more complex than what is on the surface. So today we are here to talk about well-being. Let's put it into context because we need to understand why we're talking about this topic, right? So in the context of well-being, how do you think sexual pleasure can impact an individual's well-being?
I think it can be essential in a number of different ways. And from the research that we've been doing, it does seem to be quite different between men and women. So it can be quite gender-based as well. We find for women in particular, their sexual well-being is very intertwined with their relationships. So it's more about their dyadic desire. We've done some recent research this year looking more at male desire. That seems to be more based on their solo feelings of desire, about how they feel about themselves as a sexual being. So it does seem to be quite varied.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I mean, in that context, I also wonder because, to me, like I'm still learning about this topic. Just to preface our audience, sexuality nowadays has changed so much from the previous generations, and it's not just men and women or male and female per se. And there are other sexualities that are currently being explored or embraced, especially in the LGBTIQ plus community. I think that's what it's called now. So would that also affect sexual pleasure in this context? Because I know the research probably is based on, the popular male and female as genders. So I'm not sure if it's been explored in other areas yet.
So yes, no, that's what I was going to, you just brought up something important there. Because I was going to say there's sex and there's gender. So two very separate things that can be combined or not. So what we find in this area, so when I'm saying male and female, I was saying if you're self-identifying as male or female, that can have an impact. But there's also your sexual orientation about who you're attracted to. If you're attracted to men or women or non-binary or other or pansexual. So there is a lot more, we're now recognising there's a lot more variety than was first considered. So yeah, we've got to consider both those aspects of sex and gender, and that will impact your desire.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. So would there be any common denominators there? Because obviously you said, for, let's just say for people identifying as females, it might be different from people identifying as males. One is kind of more relationship based. The other one is more individuality based, the way that I translate it. So would there be any other common denominators for both genders or for people in general in terms of their well-being?
We know for both, there are common denominators that people find it, that relationship factors will impact overall well-being, but just sort of differently for people who identify as female or male. So it does impact. So for women, it impacts their dyadic desire. For male, their relationships strangely will affect, probably shouldn't, cut that bit, I shouldn't have said strangely. Interestingly, it affects more their solo desire. So how they're going on with their relationships doesn't seem to affect their dyadic desire for their partner, and it impacts how they feel about themselves sexually.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This is my first time hearing that, so definitely something new I've learned for today. So I think in the research that our team was doing when, they were working on the questions and, the flow of this conversation, there's something that came up that I find to be interesting, which is a sex positive approach. And this is kind of related to sexuality. And because we're talking about sexual pleasure, again, a concept that is probably new to a lot of people, what does a sex positive approach to sexuality mean in the context of sexual pleasure?
So it is just recognising that people have a right to sexual pleasure. And we have known about this for a long time, of course. And back in the 70s, the World Health Organization said it was a basic human right that every human has to sexual pleasure. But for a lot of people, especially I have to say females, they had not sort of felt that it is their right to gain sexual pleasure, both in relationships and by themselves. So I think that's something that's been, people are still trying to recognise that they have this capacity to claim their own pleasure, and that's more about the sexual positivity movement.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point because I do remember growing up, I didn't hear much about female sexual pleasure. Obviously, we already established that, sexuality and genders kind of like a bit different there. So I might not be able to cover everything for everyone, and I'm trying to be as inclusive as possible. But I do remember, identifying as a female and growing up in a Southeast Asian country, I never heard much about sexual pleasure. And in fact, it used to be and still is a taboo topic to talk about it. And it's kind of something where, like when it comes to sex in general, like there's no talk about sexual pleasure. It's mainly like this act of, you gotta produce offsprings, especially in the context of Southeast Asian countries. Obviously here in Australia it's very different, and I really appreciate that people are more open-minded about it. They talk about it more, and sexual pleasure is something that is probably really recognized for all genders, and in that sense I kind of think that it's probably a continuous learning journey for a lot of people, because they might be in a whole different setup. Because I know that for us here in Australia, we're pretty lucky. We can talk about it and there's no punishment, because I know in certain countries, like it's like if you're identifying as a female, if you are a woman, you're not allowed to talk about any of that at all, let alone even think about, achieving or having sexual pleasure in your life.
Yeah, and especially in some countries, if you're same-sex attracted, that becomes more difficult. But just going back to, even in Australia, though, if you think about our sex education that we give our children and adolescents, there's no mention about pleasure. It's all focusing on the negative aspects of sexuality and the risk about not getting pregnant when you don't want to, and STIs and those sort of factors. There's no talk for young people about sexual pleasure, which you think is quite a detrimental thing for many young people, because they don't learn that this is a fundamental aspect of sexuality and sexual behavior.
Yeah. Well, that is a really good point that you brought up there. So on that topic, what would you say to the young people that didn't get this part of their education about sexual pleasure? Because you are right. You were just talking about preventing STDs, STIs, and, being really like having safe sex. There's no talk about, okay, how are you going to achieve sexual pleasure, when you, even by yourself, right? Not just when you're engaging, with another person involved there, even with yourself. It's kind of like, we don't talk about that topic because it's really taboo. It's really awkward. Let's not talk about it. So for those of us that didn't get that sex education, I know I didn't, definitely did not. What would you say to those people, to us, myself included?
So if you didn't get the information about sexual pleasure through your sexual education courses that you might have done at school or at university, it's very important then to search out what suits you best. And there's so many things on the internet which can be problematic. So I suggest finding things that are reputable, that are linked to research or a university or an educational sort of source, because otherwise there's so many myths that are still propagated across the internet.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point you raised there. What would be some of the biggest ones, the biggest myths that you see about sexual pleasure on the internet that you would like to debunk?
It's hard when you talk about the biggest ones because there's so many.
Or maybe common ones that you see personally, because I know there's so many out there.
The idea that you have to orgasm every time when you have sex, that sex is only about penetrative sex as well, not recognizing all the different sexual behaviors that you can engage in. Especially for women, penetrative sex is not always the best way to achieve orgasm if that's the aim. That we do also know that we look at just the hormones that are produced from having sexual pleasure, that having orgasms with a partner usually feel quite different to orgasms that you have by yourself. So they can be more pleasurable. They produce more endorphins when you do it with someone else as well. So there are different orgasms that people can have that can be explored.
Yeah, definitely. Because we're talking about well-being here, in this context, I would like to share something that I read the other day. So I read this book called Conversations on Love. And in that book, the author, Natasha Loon, she was talking about a conversation that she has with the author of another book the other book is called, I think, Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. I think is a pretty famous book on sexual pleasure and sexuality. And I haven't read it myself, but I've heard so much about it. Now, the reason I think she was mentioning this, and there was a part where she talked about that, was she was exploring her relationship with her husband. And there was a lot of things that she was going through. I'm not going to spoil it for the audience in case anyone wants to read it, but basically she was saying that when she lets go of the need to orgasm when they're engaging in sex and having sex with their partner, she found that it was about enjoying that, and it improved their relationship so much more and improved the intimacy so much more as well. And overall that impacts our well-being, right? Because we know that there's such a tight relationship between intimacy or sexual pleasure and other aspects that when it comes to our well-being. And I find that to be really fascinating because I I mean, obviously, as me coming from this generation, I've read a lot about other people's experiences. I sometimes talk to friends about it, and there's actually a very big mention of orgasm. And like you're saying, that's not the only thing that matters when it comes to sexual pleasure. You got to be enjoying it. Some people might orgasm without enjoying it, actually. And so that defeats the whole purpose of having sexual pleasure.
So, and I mean, sexual pleasure also, then we know how much it impacts on relationships, it increases relationship satisfaction, but also relationship satisfaction can also increase pleasure. So it's bi-directional, both impact each other. But It does need to be a bit different between, as I was saying before, males and females, self-identifying with these sorts of factors. So that makes it more complicated as well. So we know sorry, I got this a bit confused, but for women, we find that their relationship, if they feel that it's balanced between the partners, so they have a more equity in their relationship, that increases their desire and their relationship satisfaction and their desire. But for men, when their relationships are good, they actually have less solo desire for just to behave sexually with themselves because they're investing more into their relationships. Mm-hmm. So it seems to operate differently in different.
Yeah. That's a good point that you just shared there, because I think this is new information for a lot of people. I think I've read something about that in an article somewhere, but it's good to have that knowledge reaffirmed. It's always good to get that sort of reminder sometimes. It's really good to know. And I think one very big factor when it comes to sexual pleasure, especially when we're talking about, having sexual pleasure when you're engaging in, intimacy with your partners, there's this very big part of body image that's involved in there. And even for people that are, engaging in sex with, people that they just casually started seeing, compared to, with partners, there's always this very big thing about body image, especially for females, I would say, maybe even for males too. And that is because I don't know much about, the research on males, and I am a woman, so I know a little more about this area, having talked to female friends about it. Now, I wonder if there's anything in your research that might point out anything interesting about body image when it comes to sexual pleasure.
Body image can be crucial. So together with the relationship, it's the other big factor that can impact people's levels of sexual desire. So feeling positive about your own body just makes you feel more happier about sharing it with someone else. But it's also how if you're in a relationship or casually, but how that other person reflects your body appreciation back to you. You mightn't, so if you feel that the partner really enjoys your body and admires it, that will really enhance your sexual pleasure.
I think we're also very self-conscious as well, when it comes to intimacy, right? Because it's not just about being adored, but also sometimes I know talking to friends is kind of like, I feel self-conscious about this and that. And so that stops them from actually having any sexual pleasure, even though when they're engaging in intimacy, it's kind of like, oh, it's awkward. And, I didn't want to think about it, or I feel really self-conscious. So I didn't really enjoy it. And that's such a big thing to get over. It's hard.
Difficult, and it's hard also because then you can't focus on yourself and the moment because you're really worried about, oh my goodness, does my legs look really fat in this, or my boobs are too small, or for men there's something wrong with my penis, it goes to the left or the right or something like that. So then you don't get to immerse yourself in the sexual feelings and the sexual arousal that you're feeling. So if you're focused on your body, it's better if you can start doing more mindfulness and focusing on your own feelings of pleasure. Engage with that.
Yeah. I know this is also important, probably, this is self-work, obviously, very important when we, practice mindfulness and do the self-work that you just mentioned. But I also think it is important and helpful for you to have conversations about it. Now, I think for a lot of people, we have different kinds of people, different ways that people engage in intimacy, and it's different when you're in different kinds of relationships as well. But I do think that having these kinds of conversations are important when it comes to sexual pleasure, not just about body image, but probably about other aspects, because I know that when it comes to sexual pleasure, for example, recently there's a new season of Sex Education, and that's such a great TV series. And I was watching just the first few episodes of the new season, and I'm like, a lot of these problems are communication based.
You are so right with that. And the sex education program is fantastic. I watch it with my 19-year-old son who always identifies with the Otis character in that because he's got a sex educator, sex therapist mother as well.
I love that.
Of course, the series is written about him, but it's a fantastic series. But yes, communication is essential, and because sometimes it's hard in a relationship. You need to be able to tell the other person what works for you, what doesn't work for you, because everyone seems to be different in what is stimulating for them. So having the communication open between the partners is essential so they know what they're doing. I mean, they can try and guess by perhaps the other partner's movements or noises and things like that, but it's really difficult for them to know. So being able to communicate what you want is essential. But it's hard. We haven't been brought, as you've been saying from the start, we haven't been brought up to say, oh, do this for me, this is sexually stimulating, because people feel so embarrassed and start blushing. And so it does take practice, and you need to make sure your partner feels safe to express what they need in this domain.
Yeah. You are so right. And yeah, the part where we were not brought up to have such conversations is true, because, not everyone is like Otis or your son, where they have a, like sort of a sex therapist mother. And I think when it comes to creating a safe space, that is a tricky thing too, because I guess it probably comes from, lots of different sources, like, the background of how we were brought up, our own head, where we are at with our headspace. There might be a lot of different factors that affect it. So what would be a baby step then that you would say when it comes to communication? What is the baby step that we can all do so that we can create that safe space, or even feel safe ourselves to explore our needs, or, even not even explore, but sometimes once we are done exploring, we can explain it or verbalize it to our partner?
I find when I work in sex therapy with couples and things like that, that if you try and frame it in a positive way, you get a better reaction from the other person. So if you're saying, when you say it like this, probably it sounds a bit strange, but in the moment it does seem to work. That if you're frame it more as like, oh, I really like it when you do that, rather than, oh, don't touch there, sort of thing. So just say, if you say, oh, I really like it when whatever your thing is, when you stroke me in that place, or I really like it when you kiss me this way, or whatever activity you do. So if you focus on the positive aspects, or, move their hands to where you want them and say, oh, I really like it when you do that, and put it in that really, I don't want to say the word positive yet again, but it is a positive sort of frame. Yeah. Rather than focusing on things that you don't like, so the partner does, focus on the things that they do that you really do enjoy, or saying, oh, I'd really love to try, even if they're not doing it, say, I'd love to try this with you. That works well as well.
Yeah, that's good advice for sure. And it does keep things positive. But I do have to say, though, sometimes there will be things that are not so positive and we want the other person to stop, but they don't know and they might think that we enjoy it. So how do we also communicate that safely?
You can say, oh, well, That's the thing. You have to feel safe to say the things that you don't want as well. And you just have to say, if something that you really don't like, just saying, oh, that doesn't work for me. Thank you. But can we not do that anymore? I mean, you have to just sort of say the things that you don't want to do as well. It can be difficult, but it's essential.
Yeah, that's true. And when you said that, in my head, I don't know why in my head there's immediately the sentence, I'm sorry, but. And then I realized that, you know what, maybe we don't really have to phrase it like that, because we all have our own preferences and we needn't have to be sorry when we don't enjoy something. It's just like this conditioning that, oh, if you don't like something, you have to, be apologetic about it, especially women. And I find that maybe it's more common for women to apologize. I'm not sure if the research shows the same thing.
It does. It does, definitely. Well, just that idea that they don't feel that they have that right to pleasure. But for men, there's also problems. The problems that they have is more about performance anxiety, like they feel so much pressure to perform sexually. And they wouldn't feel like it all the time too. And it can be too much for them. So, so that's where it tends to happen with people who identify as male, feeling that they always have to be ready for sex and they always have to want it. But not everyone wants it all the time. Well, no one wants it all the time. So for them to feel like that they don't always have to perform, because that's where they can then get into sort of cycles in their head going, oh my God, I'm not performing. Oh my goodness, I'm not keeping it up. I'm normal. And that's when they'll start getting into, for example, erection problems.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it is this is something that is also problematic, right? Because it's not just about, women having problems when it comes to sexuality and sexual pleasure. We know that men also have their own sets of problems. And I think it's just good to be able to communicate. Again, going right back to communication is such an important thing, because I realize that a lot of the things that we keep in our head, sometimes it's just good to say it out loud. And then you might find that your partner might be thinking the same thing. Or, they might not know. No one can guess. No one can read minds. So this would be really helpful. And I think it's just such an important part of this sex education. I think there should be a bit more emphasis on communication. Not just like, oh, you need to practice safe sex. Maybe you should practice having safe conversations about sex.
Exactly. I think that's said beautifully. So just knowing that you can express these needs and that both partners will have different needs that might not be met. And if you don't discuss them, they can't be met. So it is essential just to communicate these things, but doing it in a non-threatening way and a non-accusatory way. And we probably don't do it when it's in the heat of the moment or things like that, when passions are up. So just a nice, calm way before perhaps you start venturing into these areas.
Yeah.
That can be the best time to take it. But it can be, again, can be in that positive sort of way that I really like it when you do these things, but I find this might be a bit uncomfortable for me.
Yeah.
That work well.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because the whole time you were talking about like this communication piece and exploring and explaining what you like and, framing it in a positive way, it sounds like the environment is already safe in that relationship. But I do know that it's hard because some relationship dynamics are quite tricky to navigate, especially when it comes to this like power dynamic, perhaps, like, or relationship fairness. I would probably call it power dynamic in certain relationships, because I think this is a piece that we don't talk about very often, because we know, in this day and age, it's more like, when you're engaging in intimacy with your partner, and mainly I'm talking about partners here, probably, for casual relationships, it's quite different. But, in relationships with partners, there's this concept that partners are equals. But for some relationship, it's not like that entirely. There's still a big part of the population where they experience relationships where, a person holds higher power, or, the other person might feel a bit threatened and not be able to express their needs so much. And so how would that affect sexual pleasure, and how can we overcome that?
We know for women, when the power imbalance is very unequal, it decreases their sexual pleasure, generally because we found from our research they're just too tired, because they're usually just doing too much. They're doing all the mental work, emotional work in the relationship, as well as perhaps all the housework as well. We found that they were just too exhausted to feel like sex as well. But something else that we found is that over long-term relationships, I mean, these factors can change over time. And going back to the communication issue, that's why it's good to keep communication open, because these relationships change, especially because hormonally, both men and women, their hormones will change with age as well. And for females, post-menopause, their libido can drop quite a lot. But men also, after a certain age, their libido will drop as well, because their levels of testosterone will go down too. And that can be very confronting for a number of men as well.
Yeah, definitely. It is confronting for all of us, I suppose, because it's not like you're going to have the same level of libido throughout your whole life. And so, it's not just about the power imbalance. It's also about your own self and where you're at. And I think you mentioned a really interesting point where you said, some women are just too tired. And sometimes it means too tired to engage in any sexual activity. Sometimes it means too tired to communicate, because they're just like, okay, why bother? Because I'm too tired, so might as well just go for it. And there's no sexual pleasure in that at all. And I find that to be quite sad, because we've established, sexual pleasure is important for our well-being, our relationships, and it affects us quite massively. And so when it comes to, establishing the safe space, and especially when it comes to navigating the power imbalance to achieve that sexual pleasure, what would be something that couples can probably try, one person from the couple can try if they're kind of finding it really, really hard to establish safe communication?
If you're finding it really difficult to establish safe communication, you might have to bring in another person to start the conversation safely. So exploring that. But if you can't bring in, go to counselling, use telephone counselling, even if you can't get to a counsellor or psychologist. Again, just so the other person doesn't feel defensive, is you just sort of take the conversation softly and slowly and in a positive way, saying that, I'd really like this. I really want to do what's best for our relationship. So can we please discuss X or Y, or I'd really like it if you could help me with this particular task, trying to get them on board to make it it's a group thing that you can work on together.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good point. Sometimes it's hard to start, right? But once you can start softly, I think it should slowly and surely work out. But I think counseling and bringing in another person with expertise really helps some people, because they just don't know where to start at all. And I find that professional help there is important, especially if it's a long-term relationship. We really want to work on that. Again, it depends on different kinds of relationship. And here we're only covering a few aspects of, lots of different areas of sexual pleasure. Because, for example, we might not have time to explore this, but I know that for some of my friends, they're kind of like, I'm in a phase in my life right now that I don't want a relationship, but I do want to still, work on my sexual pleasure, and I'm still going to engage in that part. And I just need to explore what I like and how to communicate with these people, because there are so many different people that they're going to meet. So yeah, that's definitely another topic in itself, I guess. We might not have time to cover it in this particular conversation, but I find that if we can have a whole separate conversation on that, it will help a lot of people, because I know that population is definitely not small.
I think that's an excellent point, that now that we are more open to different types of relationships, and that we're discussing these more, we can sort of explore that there are different areas we can consider our sexual pleasure. I mean, if we're looking at casual relationships, and once again, the thing with sexuality is everyone have different terms. So what's casual for some is not for others.
Yeah.
We're thinking about that. Again, that's where communication is key. For someone who doesn't know you well and what you like, and someone that you've just met, you need to be able to communicate what you need in the sexual domain, and also what your boundaries are, what areas that you don't want to explore, and what things you definitely don't want to do is very important.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think we've covered quite a bit of information there, and hopefully our audience has learned something. I've definitely learned a few new fun facts, or interesting facts today. Not so fun per se, but
A little bit fun.
now let's talk about something even more practical. I know you've given us some tips, but let's go into our practice part, because this might be applicable to everyone, and you can recommend something to the general population, no matter which kind of relationship they're in. So if there's one recommendation, one practice that you would share with our audience to improve their sexual pleasure, what would that be?
First of all, before you explore these things with a partner, you got to know what works for you, what's pleasurable for you. So having that time to explore your own body if you haven't done it before, because you assume that everyone has, but this is not necessarily the case. So having that time, and make sure you made time where you'll have some private time. No one's going to disturb you. No one's going to ring up or knock on the door. Some private time to explore your own body and find out what factors stimulate you is essential. Because these days it's easy to access different sort of sex toys and things like that. You can get them posted to you. You don't have to go to the sex shops that you had to in the past and get some brown paper bags and hide your face when you're going in. You can try different, I find especially with some female clients, different types of vibrators. You can get ones all sorts of shapes and sizes. Start off with some one of those just to be able to explore your own body to see what you like. Maybe a small, what's called a bullet vibrator, which is just a small little one, just to be able to try what zones actually work for you and what stimulates you is very important, because then you can share that with others, or you can just use it to explore with yourself and not have to share it with anyone if that's not what you want to do. So I think that's an important thing, to find out what works for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good advice. I think such a great thing, especially when it comes to knowing ourselves, right? We were talking about that in the beginning. Sometimes we don't even know where we stand with all these things. And I think understanding what we like and don't like will help us to nurture that effective communication in that safe space that we were just talking about. Because sometimes it's not just about establishing the safe space. Sometimes we don't even know what to communicate because we don't know ourselves.
Yeah. I find that, especially with some of my older clients that I've had in the past, they had never even considered these sorts of things. So it's very important to find out. And they've been very excited when they've gone off and explored these things and found out what works for them. So, that's what it was all about. We've heard such things and they just thought that maybe it just didn't happen for them, but they just didn't know how to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that reminds me of Amy, the character from Sex Education. I love Amy, especially the part where she started to explore herself. Now, this is for if anyone in our audience has not watched Sex Education, highly recommend it. It's such a great show. No matter which age you're at, I think it's so great to watch, because it opens our eyes to all these different sets of problems that we don't see because we don't talk about it. I just really love Amy because I love the part where she started to take a break from being in a relationship so she can explore herself, her own sexual pleasure, especially. And in the new season, she has a ranking system, which was hilarious. I really love that. So I think it is a really good way, it's not like we need to be like Amy and do the exact same thing, but I think that perspective of, getting to know yourself so that you can, explore sexual pleasure when you're in a relationship with another person, that will be really helpful because you're so sure of yourself. You don't really need to be like, oh, I don't know. Or, I don't even know if this is working, because you know exactly where you stand.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I'm just thinking about the sex education program, watching it with my son, opened up all sorts of conversations between the two of us. And this is an area that we've covered quite a lot. And he often just goes, oh, yeah, shut up, Mum. Stop talking about these things. Stop asking me if I'm all right. So in these domains. But perhaps sometimes watching a program like that can bring up, you can sort of, with someone that you're feeling a bit shy about, you can sort of say, oh, what did you think about that character or something like that? So that could open up another mode of communication as well, if it's something that you're finding a bit difficult to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad there's that TV show so more people can, watch it, or they can watch it together if they're in a relationship, they want to explore different things. And sometimes conversation starters can come from things like a TV show if it's hard for you to kind of bring it up out of nowhere, right? And so that's why I really adore that, because they started to talk about things. Another show that's also fun to watch on this topic and quite relatable is probably Big Mouth. That cartoon TV series on Netflix is so good. So I think it's really great that nowadays we have more resources that we can turn to. So, if people don't know where to start, I think they can start with those resources. And then, like you were saying, reading research actually done by universities rather than just anything random on the internet. If you don't know where to start, really good place to kind of get cracking. And, it's so important for people of all ages to know about this. So thank you again for sharing that. And it sounds to me like you're a very cool mom to talk to your son about it.
Well, he doesn't think so, of course. He's not embarrassing. That's how you're supposed to be at this age. So, yeah.
Well, 10 years from now, with hindsight, he'll know that you're such a cool mom for talking to him about these things. I think it's just good for us to have people in our lives that can talk to us about such topic. And, even better if that's our sex therapist mom, like, your son or autist. Anyway, we have covered quite a bit today. And I know that, again, this is a tough topic to talk about, even for myself. Like, I find it kind of hard to bring up certain things, but it's been important to have this conversation with you. And so really thank you for sharing that insight. Before we let you go, we have open mic. As I said earlier, this is the last part in the conversation where you can talk about anything you're passionate about. I know you have so many different domains that you've been working on. So not sure what you would like to talk about today. I'm curious. So go for it.
It's so hard when you just open up and you can talk about anything. I just think this area about sexual pleasure and having sexual wellness and body positivity is so essential. I know with my research group, we've been exploring individual factors and psychological factors that affect desire. Next year, we're focusing on the body and how body factors impact desire. So that's the next area that we'll move on to. As you brought up in the introduction, some of the other areas that I've looked at is also looking at how screening people for body dysmorphic disorder before they have cosmetic procedures. And so that's another factor that I've been looking at recently as well. Generally, there's just so many interesting factors to explore in life, aren't there? So many interesting things to do.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're going to be excited to read more on your research next year, when you have that out. So that's an interesting point. And speaking of which, if our audience would like to find out more about your work, where should they go?
So I work for Swinburne University, so you can look at me up on the Swinburne University website, Simone Buzwell. There's no other Buzwell, so it's quite easy to find that way. Yeah.
Yep. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for being here, being so generous with your time and energy. And I've really had a lot of fun in this conversation. I think what I'll do after this is definitely do a bit more research and, get to know myself better, get to know, the different aspects of sexual pleasure even better based on research. I think this is fascinating because, again, I don't talk to my friends about this very often. Not like your friends, because we don't have a friend like you yet. So this is a really good thing to start talking about when we have more information. So yeah, thank you again.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Lu. Thank you.
You have been listening to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights podcast produced by the Wellbeing Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, we.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.